Hello everyone. Today we're going to see if ChatGPT can make Tableau reports. I'm going to converse with ChatGPT and ask it questions as though it were a fellow data analyst. Then we will implement everything it asks us to do in Tableau and see what kind of dashboard we end up with. Let's get into it. Let's start with our first prompt. You're a data analyst working with the superstore dataset. I want you to develop a Tableau dashboard. So here's ChatGPT's response. It talks about 5 metrics that we should be focusing on, being sales, profit, product, customer, and shipping. Then it talks about how to lay out these metrics, and I just read this as having one tab for each of the key metrics, which sounds very reasonable. So next up, I'm going to tell ChatGPT, let's focus on one sheet at a time. What should go on the first page? In its response, it's asking us to create the sales overview visualization first. That sounds pretty reasonable. It asks us to make a line chart for total sales, some drop downs, adding a title, putting in some legends and annotations, and adding in some interactivity. That all sounds like a great place to start, so let's get into Tableau and implement some of this. Here we have the start of our dashboard. We've added a line chart for total sales over time. On the x-axis, we have the time. The y-axis has the total sales. We've color encoded it by region. We've got some tooltips, and we've got a filter that shows the region, category, and specific time periods. Point 2 and 3 asks us to add some drop-down filters, which also is mentioned in point 1. But yes, we do have the region selection and also a drop-down for time selection. Interestingly enough, this is not an out-of-the-box feature. I actually had to put in a parameter and a formula to allow us to toggle between year, quarter, and month. Point number 4 asks us to put a clear and descriptive title for the visualization, sales overview by region, which we've done. It also asks us to include a brief description, but since it hasn't given us a description, we'll ask it to clarify a little down the line. Point 5 asks us to include a legend to explain the color coding, which is already built in by default, and asks us to put some annotations and trend lines, and again, it hasn't given us any details, so we will ask it to elaborate. Finally, point 6 talks about interactivity. It asks us to make the visualization interactive by allowing users to hover over data points. That's already built into Tableau, and it asks us to enable cross-filtering. Well, it's only given us one graph, so there's not much to cross-filter right now, but I'm sure that will be built out down the line. So we're going to give some feedback to ChatGPT. We're going to tell it that the first page is looking a bit lackluster, and can you detail 3 more visualizations for the sales overview dashboard? So in its response, it's given us 3 more additional visualizations, a bar chart for sales by category, a map for sales by region, and a tree map for sales by subcategory. That sounds pretty good, so let's implement that. And here we have our dashboard with the 3 new visualizations, starting with the bar chart for sales by category. So we've created a horizontal bar chart to show each product category, total sales on the X and the product categories on the Y. It's all color encoded, and we've sorted it for top sales. Every single chart has tooltips built in by default, and I've labeled each of the graphs. We've got our map for sales by region. We've used a map visualization to show total sales across the different regions. It's color encoded based on the total sales with darker shades for higher sales. And we've got a legend down the bottom. For the tree map, we've created one to show the sales distribution across the different categories. It's asked us to display each subcategory as rectangles with sizes proportional to their sales. We've color encoded it for different colors for each subcategory. In terms of enabling interaction to drill down, not really sure what it means by that, so we'll ask it to elaborate. So it's definitely a good start, but it is a very basic dashboard at the moment. So let's get back into ChatGPT and see how we can get it to improve upon its own work. So for my next prompt, I'm going to say, I've implemented the 4 visualizations as you've instructed, but the sales overview page is looking a bit basic. Any tips on how to spruce it up and add that wow factor? So it's given us 8 points in its response. It asks us to use color wisely, add images and icons, apply creative chart designs, implement animations, incorporate storytelling, add interactivity. optimize layout and white space, and to use custom fonts and typography. That all sounds very reasonable. So let's get us to focus on the first point, using colors wisely. I'm going to ask it, starting with step 1, using colors wisely, please give specific instructions on what to color each section of the visualization. Include colors for the background, fonts for each section, colors for each chart and category, etc. So in its response, it's given us specific colors for the background, the fonts, and each of the visualizations, including all the hex codes. So let's implement that in Tableau and see how our dashboard looks. So I've set the background color to light gray. I've changed the font and texts for the titles being dark blue. I've changed all the axes and data labels to be dark gray, and I've made the tooltips light gray. For the line chart, it's asked for different shades of blue for the different lines. It asks for some data points, which I've added, and it asks for the tooltips to be in light blue. For the bar chart, it asks for these specific shades of green for the different categories. It also asks for the data labels, so I've added those data labels, and it wants the tooltips to be in light green. For the map, it wants a white background, and it wants its region colors using shades of orange, which I've changed, and it wants the tooltips to stay in dark gray, I guess. For the tree map, it asks us to use the categorical color palette, so I followed the color palette from the bar chart above. But it also asks for different shades for the subcategories, but since it's already different shades of green, I didn't think it wise to implement that. So here's a dashboard according to ChatGPT's color scheme. Honestly, it looks like it was colored in by a 5-year-old, but let's get back to ChatGPT and forge on with its other suggestions. Its second suggestion asks us to add images and icons. I'm going to skip over that one. Point 3 asks us to apply creative chart design. So I'm going to ask it, I've used colors wisely as you suggested. Let's move on to point 3, applying creative chart designs. Currently, each visualization in the sales overview page is just using the default Tableau format with the color changes you suggested. Please provide detailed steps on how you would like me to change each chart to make them more creative. Its response has given us some feedback for each of the visualizations. So let's get back into Tableau and implement these. For the line chart, it asks us to change the line chart to an area chart. So I've done that. It's asked us to add a subtle gradient. That kind of already happened with the original colors that we've added. And it asks us to implement a subtle animation effect. I asked it to elaborate on this, and basically it just tells us to keep the default animations on in Tableau. For the bar chart, it asks us to transform it into a horizontal waterfall chart, but that seems very ridiculous, so I'm not going to be doing that. Instead, I've just recolored the categories, and you'll see why in a second when we get to the tree map changes. For the map, it's asked us to create a custom background that reflects the geographic regions covered by Superstore, adding a thematic element. Not really sure what that means. So I ignored that. Implement a heat map overlay. Well, the colors that we use kind of already do that. And it asks us for interactive elements such as zooming and panning. Well, that comes out of the box by default. For the tree map, it seems to have completely changed its mind and asked for a sunburst chart instead with the categories and the subcategories. And now you can see why I needed the contrasting colors, because it asks us to make a radial gradient for the sunburst chart. So we need contrasting colors so then we can gradient each section separately. Dashboard's definitely looking a lot better now, so let's continue on. So the next point deals with implementing animations, but as I explained, what it means by this is basically just utilizing default Tableau animations, and there's not really much animation customization you can do in Tableau anyway. So we'll move on to incorporating storytelling. I'm going to ask ChatGPT. I've now applied the creative chart designs. For point 5, incorporate storytelling. Please provide details on how you would like me to logically sequence my visualizations and detail on what annotation and text boxes to add, including the actual text. So in its response, it's given us some specific annotations for each section of the dashboard. And it's given us some suggestions on how to reorder the dashboard. It does start talking about this customer segmentation section, which we haven't implemented yet. So I had to reprompt ChatGPT and tell it that it's hallucinating a little bit and that we haven't implemented customer segmentation, and please provide an annotation for the subcategory sunburst chart instead. So let's implement these annotations and see how our dashboard looks. So back in Tableau, we've swapped the category and the region section as requested by ChatGPT. I've also implemented all the annotations, one for the overview of the dashboard and one for each section of the dashboard. Interestingly enough, some of the annotations seem correct and some seem a little bit off. We can see in the sales performance over time, there is spikes in December, so that seems accurate. And in the sales by region, it talks about how the Midwest and the West regions are contributing the highest sales, which also seems reasonable. Sales by category type, it talks about the top selling category being office supplies, and we can clearly see that's not the case. I believe that's probably because I'm using ChatGPT 3.5 and it's reading off an older superstore dataset. If you're using GPT-4 and feeding it live data, you probably might get more accurate annotations, but use with caution. Back to ChatGPT, I'm going to tell it, I've completed step 5, incorporating storytelling. Can you please provide details on step 6, adding interactivity to the sales overview page given the 4 graphs we have? Focus on useful global filters and how visualizations should interact with one another. Its response details some global filters and how the visualizations should interact. So let's get back into Tableau and implement that. So it's asked for these global filters for the date range and the region. Well, the region is already there from before. The date range selector is probably pretty useful. So I've added 2 parameters for a start and end date and applied that to all the visualizations. If we read through all of its points about visualization interactivity, basically what it's saying is every single graph should act as a filter for every other graph. So I've implemented that accordingly. And as you can see, when we click on one graph, it will filter down the other graphs. So back to ChatGPT, we're going to implement one more step. So I'm going to say for step 7, optimizing layout and whitespace, can you give details on how the 4 visualizations should be set up, the pixels of whitespace between them and the title, where the global filter should go, etc. So it's given us some specific details of what we asked. Let's implement all of that in Tableau and see how our dashboard ends up looking. So first it's asked us to place the dashboard title prominently up the top and use a larger font size to grab attention. Then it asks us to position the global filters on a sidebar on the left. So I've just used a darker shade of gray to distinguish the sidebar, and it asks us to use a slightly larger font and bold styling to make it stand out. Its second point deals with layout. It tells us exactly where to put the 4 graphs. Interestingly enough, it's asked us to change region and category again, which I'm not going to bother doing since it's not going to make much difference. And finally, for whitespace allocation, it asks us to allocate 20 pixels of whitespace between each visualization to prevent clutter, which sounds great. So all I've done is add a 10 pixel padding border around each visualization, and it asks us to use some whitespace around the dashboard title and global filters to create separation, which I've implemented as well. So I think we'll leave it here for now. ChatGPT seems to have created a fairly decent dashboard. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it is clear and concise. It focuses on the key metrics pretty well for a sales overview. So if you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. And if we get enough interest, I might go back and implement the other sections of the dashboard ChatGPT suggested at the start.